In the vast, silent archives of human conflict, there are millions of letters written by men who knew they were stepping into the unknown. Most of these fragile pieces of paper speak of mundane things: the weather, the lack of rations, the distant hope for a swift return to a quiet life. But occasionally, history leaves us a document so profoundly haunting, so terrifyingly lucid, that it completely transcends the era in which it was written. What happens when a man looks into the horizon of a coming conflict and realizes, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that his time on this earth is drawing to a close? Today, we are opening the forgotten files of the American Civil War to examine a masterpiece of sorrow and premonition. It is a letter that was never meant for the history books, written in the dead of night by a man torn between an immense, consuming love for his family and the unforgiving duty to a fracturing nation. We are going to retrace the final footsteps of Major Sullivan Ballou, decipher the chilling clarity of his last words, and uncover the tragic, shadowed aftermath that the official records so often leave buried in the dust. If you have ever wondered what goes through the mind of a leader just moments before the world descends into chaos, you are about to find out. The night of July 14th, 1861, wrapped around Camp Clark in Washington like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Across the sprawling encampment, thousands of young men lay in a restless sleep, their breathing forming a collective, rhythmic hum beneath the vast expanse of the dark sky. These were untested volunteers, dreaming of glory, entirely unaware of the grim, unforgiving reality that awaited them just a few days' march away. But inside one dimly lit tent, illuminated only by the fragile, flickering glow of a solitary candle, there was no sleep. There was only the sharp, deliberate scratching of a pen against paper. Major Sullivan Ballou, a 32-year-old lawyer and politician from Rhode Island, sat completely alone in the crushing silence of the early morning. Leadership in the military is an inherently isolating experience, but in those quiet hours before the dawn, that isolation transforms into a heavy, physical weight pressing down on the chest. Outside his canvas walls, the cold wind whispered through the tents, carrying with it the undeniable tension of a nation standing on the absolute brink of tragedy. Ballou was not a hardened career soldier. He was a man of the law, a man of profound intellect, and above all, a man deeply anchored to the quiet life he had built far away from the military lines. Yet, on this specific night, a haunting clarity had settled over him. The scratching of his pen was methodical, every word chosen with the agonizing precision of someone crafting a final testament. He was writing to his wife, Sarah, but this was no ordinary correspondence. The air in the tent was thick with an unseen presence, the undeniable premonition of his own definitive end. He did not write with the panicked frenzy of a frightened man, but with the chilling, melancholic calmness of a soul that has already accepted its fate. The shadows dancing on the canvas walls seemed to stretch and contort, mirroring the internal tempest of a man standing on the edge of a great, dark precipice, looking back one last time at the warmth of the light he was about to leave behind forever. To truly understand the weight of this night, we must step away from the grand, sweeping narrative of the American Civil War. We must leave behind the statistics, the troop movements, and the political rhetoric of 1861. Instead, we must look at the man holding the pen. Sullivan Ballou was not a hardened combat veteran built for the grim realities of the front lines. Back in Rhode Island, he was a respected attorney, a rising figure in the state legislature, and a man deeply anchored to a quiet civilian life. But more than anything else, his entire universe revolved around his wife, Sarah, and their two young sons, Edgar and William. Leaving them was not an act of youthful bravado or a naive thirst for adventure. It was the result of an agonizing, suffocating moral conflict that tore at the very fabric of his identity. When you read the historical accounts of the men who marched south, you often find a sense of invincible optimism, a belief that the conflict would be resolved in a matter of weeks, and everyone would return home as heroes. Ballou harbored no such illusions. He understood the monumental scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the nation was on the verge of total collapse, and that the future his children would inherit was heavily dependent on the sacrifices made in the present. The struggle that consumed him in the quiet of his tent was a violent collision between two unstoppable forces, an immeasurable, deathless love for his family, and a cold, inescapable sense of duty to his country. He wrote to Sarah of how his love for her seemed to bind him with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. Yet, a fierce, driving wind of patriotism was sweeping him toward the battlefield, pulling those cables to their absolute breaking point. Imagine the psychological torment of that realization. He was acutely aware that by honoring his duty, he was actively tearing away the foundation of his own family. He was choosing to leave Sarah to navigate a harsh, unforgiving world alone. Every stroke of his pen on that dimly lit paper was an attempt to explain the unexplainable, to beg for her forgiveness for choosing a path that he knew, with terrifying clarity, would shatter her heart. But to fully grasp the overwhelming gravity of this document, we need to pause our chronological journey exactly here and look very closely at the psychological phenomenon unfolding within his words. Because as the letter progresses, Ballou stops hoping for a safe return. He stops trying to comfort his wife with empty promises of a reunion in this life. Instead, his words cross an invisible threshold into something far more profound and unsettling. But we need to pause exactly here. Before we move forward into the dust and chaos of what awaited this man, we have to examine the profound psychological threshold he crosses in this very document. If you read thousands of letters from the front lines of any major conflict in human history, you will notice a distinct, almost universal pattern. Soldiers, no matter how desperate their situation, inherently cling to the concept of tomorrow. They write about the meals they will eat when they get home, the children they will hold again, the quiet lives they will resume once the guns finally fall silent. Hope is the ultimate survival mechanism. It is the shield the human mind creates to protect itself from the paralyzing terror of mortality. But as we read Sullivan Ballou's letter, that shield is entirely absent. He does not speak of his return as a possibility. He speaks of his end as an absolute, undeniable fact. He writes to Sarah that he has no misgivings about the cause in which he is engaged, and that his courage does not halt or falter. He acknowledges how heavily the future of American civilization leans upon the triumph of the government. And then, the tone shifts into something devastating. He tells her, with heartbreaking clarity, that he feels a strong, almost unalterable premonition that he shall not return. This is not the voice of a man succumbing to panic. This is something far more chilling. How does the human brain process the absolute certainty of its own end? Military historians and psychologists have long debated this rare phenomenon, often referred to as pre-battle clarity. It is a state of mind where the instinct for self-preservation simply dissolves, replaced by a cold, devastating acceptance of fate. Ballou was a highly educated man, an attorney trained to analyze evidence and probabilities. Yet, on that July night, his logic was overridden by a profound, inexplicable instinct. He was not predicting the outcome of a battle. He was reading the final page of his own life story. He was effectively preparing his own departure, wrapping his affairs and his emotions into neat, agonizingly beautiful sentences, so his wife would not be left searching for answers in the dark. The poetic grace of his words, promising to wait for her, telling her that if the departed can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, he would always be near her, masks the absolute weight of the void he was stepping into. He was assuring Sarah that he would remain with her in the shadows and the summer breeze, specifically because he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the physical man was never coming home. And as the sun slowly began to rise over Camp Clark, replacing the heavy darkness of the night with the harsh, unforgiving light of morning, the time for writing came to an end. The letter was folded, sealed, and handed over to the shadows of the military postal system. The premonition was recorded. Now, all that remained was the march. 7 days later, the agonizing wait was over. The profound silence of that quiet encampment was violently replaced by a deafening, unrelenting roar under the sweltering July sun of Virginia. The First Battle of Bull Run was not merely a military engagement. It was a devastating collision of romanticized 19th century ideals and the unforgiving, mechanical reality of modern conflict. Thousands of men, including Major Sullivan Ballou, marched onto the fields of Manassas, while civilians literally sat on nearby hills with picnic baskets, holding on to the naive, collective belief of a swift, glorious victory. But the landscape quickly dissolved into a chaotic tempest of smoke, confusion, and overwhelming human tragedy. As a commanding officer of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry, Ballou was thrust directly into the absolute heart of the maelstrom. The air grew thick with the suffocating scent of sulfur and the desperate, fading voices of young men realizing that the grand stories of honor they had been told were entirely hollow. It was here, amidst the stifling heat and the blinding fog of the conflict, that the heavy premonition of July 14th finally materialized into cold reality. While attempting to rally his weary, fragmented men, striving to be the unshakable pillar of leadership his country demanded of him, the inevitable arrived. A heavy artillery projectile tore through the chaotic lines, striking his horse and inflicting a devastating, insurmountable toll on the major himself. The romanticized illusion of the era often dictates a cinematic, poetic departure for its fallen leaders, but the fields of Manassas offered no such grace. There was no dramatic final speech, no gentle fade to black. He was swiftly carried away from the fracturing front lines, his physical form shattered beyond repair. Yet his mind undoubtedly replaying the exact promises he had penned to his wife just days before. The grim fate he had so clearly accepted in the dark solitude of his tent had finally caught up to him, sweeping him away into the shadows of history. He lingered for a week in a makeshift, overwhelmed field hospital, a prisoner to the harsh conditions and fading strength, before finally closing his eyes for the last time. His prophecy was fulfilled with terrifying surgical precision. The man was gone, leaving behind only the echoing silence of his absence. But the story of Sullivan Ballou does not end with his last breath in a forgotten hospital tent. In fact, the most melancholic and obscure chapter of this tragedy was only just beginning. We must now turn our attention to the grim aftermath, to the shadows that history official records often attempt to ignore, and to a fragile piece of paper that was still making its agonizingly slow journey through the dark. When the smoke finally cleared over the fields of Manassas, it left behind a profound, suffocating silence that stood in stark contrast to the deafening roar of the previous days. But the tragedy of Major Sullivan Ballou was far from complete. To fully comprehend the emotional devastation of this story, we must look away from the battlefield and trace the agonizingly slow journey of a fragile, folded piece of paper making its way north. In 1861, there were no instant notifications, no immediate telegrams dispatched to the homes of the fallen. Information traveled at the speed of a horse-drawn carriage or a steam train, creating a terrifying limbo for the families left behind. For weeks, Sarah Ballou waited in Rhode Island, entirely consumed by the agonizing uncertainty that followed the news of the Union defeat at Bull Run. She scoured the incomplete casualty lists printed in the local newspapers, her heart caught in a paralyzing space between fragile hope and profound despair. She did not know that the husband she loved so deeply was already gone, and she certainly did not know that somewhere in the chaotic, overburdened military postal system, a letter was slowly making its way to her, a letter carrying the final words of a ghost. But we must pause here to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth that the grand, polished monuments of history actively attempt to erase. The nightmare of Sullivan Ballou did not end with his final breath in that grim field hospital. His initial resting place in Virginia was not granted the solemn, eternal peace that a fallen leader is traditionally promised. In the bitter, chaotic weeks that followed the Confederate victory, the temporary graves of Union officers were subjected to the harsh, unforgiving resentment of a deeply divided nation. Historical records, long kept in the shadows, reveal that Ballou's final sanctuary was tragically disturbed by opposing forces. He was temporarily denied the basic dignity of an undisturbed rest, a dark and melancholic secret that military officials later discovered when they returned to the area to recover their fallen. It is a bleak, chilling reminder that the true cost of conflict extends far beyond the moment the guns stop firing, stripping away the romantic veneer of the era to reveal a profoundly unforgiving reality. While this grim injustice was unfolding in the Virginia dirt, Ballou's letter continued its silent journey. It is a haunting thought. The physical man had already met a tragic fate, his rest violently interrupted, yet his words were still alive, traveling through the hands of postmasters and couriers, completely unaware of the heavy sorrow they were about to deliver. The letter became a time capsule of a love that had already been severed by the harsh reality of a fractured nation. Imagine the immense psychological weight of that approaching envelope. It was not just a piece of correspondence. It was the definitive end of Sarah's world, slowly moving closer to her front door with every passing day, carrying a premonition that had already come true in the most devastating way possible. When the letter finally arrived in Smithfield, Rhode Island, the summer of 1861 was drawing to a close. The news of the devastating Union defeat at Bull Run had already cast a dark shadow over the nation, and the grim reality of her husband's fate had already reached her doorstep. Sarah Ballou opened the envelope, holding a piece of paper that was written by a man who had already passed into eternity. As her eyes moved across the carefully pressed ink, she was not just reading a farewell, she was receiving a profound, eternal promise that defied the very boundaries of mortality. Sullivan Ballou wrote that if the departed can return to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, he would always be near her. In the gladdening breeze, he promised, and in the dark night, she would feel his unseen presence. He begged her, with a poetic grace that masked a terrifying reality, not to mourn his physical absence, but to simply wait for him. He assured her that when the soft summer wind fanned her cheek, it would be his breath, and when the cool air touched her throbbing temple, it would be his spirit passing by. Imagine the overwhelming tide of grief and haunting beauty washing over her in that exact moment in her quiet home. The man she loved so deeply had foreseen his own tragic end with chilling accuracy, yet he had used his final moments of clarity not to lament his own fate, but to build a bridge across the void for her. Sarah Ballou would go on to live a long, quiet life, carrying the immense weight of that sacrifice. She never remarried. She kept his letter close, a fragile, physical tether to the man who marched into the dust of Manassas and never returned, choosing instead to become the whisper in the wind he promised he would be. When we look back at the grand, sweeping narratives of our past, it is far too easy to get lost in the cold statistics of shifting borders, political rhetoric, and massive troop movements. We build imposing stone monuments to commemorate the strategic brilliance of generals and the overarching causes of nations. But the true, undeniable cost of human conflict is rarely carved into marble. It is recorded in the fragile, fading ink of letters written by a flickering candlelight. It is found in the agonizing moral choices made by men who knew with devastating certainty that they were walking straight into an abyss, and it echoes in the quiet, enduring sorrow of those they were forced to leave behind. Major Sullivan Ballou was lost to the chaotic shadows of the American Civil War, his physical presence violently erased on a Virginia field. But through a few sheets of paper, written in the deepest hours of the night, he achieved a different, far more powerful kind of immortality. He left behind a timeless testament that forces us to look past the uniforms and the flags, reminding us all that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments of human destruction, the things we write in our final hours are the only things that truly survive.